When you create a pivot table from the Insert menu, the top section of the Create Pivot Table dialog box provides two options: getting the data from an Excel table or range, and getting the data from an external data source. Only the first of these has been discussed in videos to this point. The current video discusses the second option. Surprisingly, in my searches on the web and books about pivot tables, I have found very little about this option. There is plenty about using Microsoft Query to import external data as a basis for creating a pivot table, and there is also a lot about using Power Pivot for the same purpose. Both of these technologies, especially Power Pivot, are discussed in detail in other videos in this series. However, basing a pivot table on external data by using the option in the Create Pivot Table dialog box doesn't receive as much attention. When I select the Use an External Data Source option, I must then click the Choose Connection button. This takes me to a list of existing connections. Of course, your list will be different from mine. As you can see, there are three possible locations for the connections: in this workbook, on a network, and on this computer. In addition, you can browse for more. The question is what a connection really is, and why this particular list shows up on my computer. Let's just say there are a lot of possibilities, as you can see when I click Browse for More and look at the list of data source extensions. There are two basic types of connections. First, a connection can be to a data source itself, such as an Access Stored Query in an MDB file, a SQL Server database table, or even a table in an Excel file. Alternatively, a connection can be to a small text file in some obscure folder on your hard drive that contains information about the data source and points to it. These small connection files can have various extensions, including the extension ODC, which stands for Office Data Connection, DSN, which stands for Database Source Name, and IQY or OQY, where the QY stands for Query. You don't have to understand the contents of these files or even look up them, but you should realize that they include information about your existing connections. Where do these text files come from in the first place? Note in the Existing Connections dialog box, when I click Browse for More, there is a New Source button. This takes me to a dialog box. Actually, I get to this same dialog box if I choose From Data Connection Wizard in the From Other Sources list on the Data ribbon. From here, I can select a source type and then specify information about the source. This information is then stored in a small text file on my hard drive, and the connection shows up in my list of connections from then on, so that I don't have to re-specify the information about the data source each time I want to use it. Again, the number of possibilities is quite large, but I will conclude this video by providing two typical examples. In the first, I will base a pivot table on an existing connection in my list. This connection is to the Northwind Order Details Extended query stored in the Northwind database file, and the pointer to this information is in a small ODC file which I created earlier. Now all I have to do is choose this connection, and a pivot table opens automatically. Then I could drag fields to the pivot table in the usual way. Also note that when I click the Connections button on the Data ribbon, I see the connection. And if I look at the Definition tab in the Properties dialog box, I can see the name of the query. As a second illustration, I will base a pivot table on an Excel table named Orders in another Excel workbook called Customer Orders. This time there is no existing connection to the data source in my list, so I will have to browse for the file and then choose the table for the source. Again, a pivot table opens, and I could manipulate it in the usual way. Also, I can again see information about the connection. In summary, if you want to base a pivot table on external data, and you want to do this from the Create Pivot Table dialog box, as opposed to using Microsoft Query or Power Pivot, for example, you will either have to choose an existing connection you have already set up, or you will have to locate a new data source. The possibilities are almost limitless, so you will have to experiment.